All right. Well, welcome back. My name is David Trahan. I'm the Executive Director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. This is the second segment talking about the federal legislation in the Senate now being considered around firearms and firearm policy. Real quickly, I want to touch on a couple more proposals that are in the federal legislation I didn't speak about in segment one. There's a proposal to increase penalties for straw purchasing. That's when an individual acquires a firearm on behalf of somebody else who intends to use it to commit a crime or do violence. A lot of gun rights groups have been asking for that for a long time. So that is part of the proposal. There's also a component related to what's called the boyfriend loophole in domestic violence cases, uh, protection from abuse cases. Boyfriends are basically not part of that process where they could have their firearm rights taken away. That's probably the most controversial piece of the legislation. And so that will get seriously vetted. The state of Maine has a similar law now that I think the feds are also looking at. So, and then there is one more component to develop what's called telemedicine mental health services. That's crucial to our so-called reforms of the protective custody statute. And when I get to the segment around the Press Herald's editorial, I'll speak more to that. Rural states like Maine have very limited mental health services, and this piece is particularly important to rural states like Maine. So with that, I do want to talk a little bit about red flag and the politics of the red flag legislation. Uh, Michael Bloomberg's organizations, and we all know that he's from New York and he's been advocating for gun control for some time now. Their answer to a lot of our problems has been this so-called red flag legislation. Let me make it clearer to the listeners what red flag is. Red flag is an attempt to flush your constitutional and civil rights down the toilet. Think about it. We have this Bill of Rights and we have these constitutional freedoms that are guaranteed. They're trying to create a process by which, based on an individual's accusations or complaint, you can have those rights taken away. Well, think about this for a minute. Only the Supreme Court can rule on your freedoms. In other words, even Congress can't pass legislation that infringes on your constitutional freedoms. The courts will step in and say, no, you've gone too far. Only the court establishes the ability for lawmakers to take your freedoms away. They're trying to create these laws that say, well, we're going to circumvent that because we think the risk an individual has because he owns or possesses firearms is so great. We're going to intervene and take those rights away until the individual can then prove that they're not a risk. Well, good luck with that, because once you've been labeled with a scarlet letter,
Yeah.
isn't that funny how scarlet's the same color as red flag? You have to prove that you're not a risk. It's nearly impossible. And so when implementing red flag, we've argued, and so has the gun rights community, not that we want to never take firearms away from people, but if you're going to take a freedom away, then you should at least follow our Supreme Court legal precedent and use the due process guaranteed under our Constitution for a gun owner. Don't single gun owners out, especially legal law-abiding gun owners, as some sort of lesser individual who has, just because you own firearms, that the government has the right to take your rights away when they don't offer the same treatment of all other Americans. For instance, I might argue that a person with a car or a knife is as much a threat as a person with a gun. Are we going to start taking away your right to an automobile because somebody has complained and said, hey, maybe they'll use that automobile to kill people? So we want the courts and any process to honor a person's right to due process. So when this so-called yellow flag came up, our organization engaged with the best legal minds in the state, two ex-attorney generals, Derek Langhauser at the time was the legal counsel for the governor. And the governor, who was an ex-attorney general, and said, what can we do to capture these at-risk individuals who are a risk to themselves and others in a way that honors due process? We did that. We spent weeks working at the highest level with John Chapman, an attorney out of Portland, to reform our protected custody statute. In that process, we established the highest levels of due process, words like clear and convincing evidence, when taking a person's liberty away. The Judiciary Committee, the Criminal Justice Committee, all of these committees of expertise weighed in on these proposals. And we came up with a piece of legislation that passed with broad bipartisan support, more than 2/3 of the legislature. We did it without the support of the gun control groups. Moms Demand Action said that they would stay out of it and play neutral. They did not. They worked behind the scenes. The Gun Safety Coalition did as well to undermine those reforms. The healthcare community, particularly the Maine Hospital Association, wanted no part in doing what we needed to have, and that was the medical assessments. To some degree, the legislature failed to fulfill a component of these protected custody reforms. As part of the reforms, they were supposed to create a telemedicine process for medical providers to do the assessments of the individual in protected custody through the telemedicine. That would have created some distance between the medical professionals and providers and the person who may be violent. That was an important piece of the legislation. The legislation called for the development of this telemedicine component. The hospitals resisted and refused to do the assessments until that telemedicine component was developed. That's what slowed the implementation. Press Herald, in their editorial, said that we weakened the law and it has limited impact. No, we didn't. We strengthened the law, the very opposite. What happened in the delays in its implementation were not because the law was flawed. It was because the associations, the medical associations, were waiting for that telemedicine to be developed. Well, guess what? The last legislative session, it was developed. Yet the press is using that delayed implementation as a way to undermine the legislation, to try to promote red flag. If the Press Herald had called us before writing their editorial, they would have known that. But they chose not to, because they're already committed to the lesser standards in red flag. It was incredibly unfair, and I'll get to their editorial in a moment and explain to you why it was tremendously unfair. Getting back to the yellow flag, the federal legislation, in order to get 10 Republicans to support it, needed those highest due process levels to move forward. In essence, Maine gave the federal folks a way to move forward on this so-called red flag. What has happened is, in order for states to qualify for grants under the federal legislation, they needed to meet the highest court precedents when creating these so-called red flag or yellow flag statutes. That's a good thing. I can't understand how some in elected office, Democrats, Republicans, or unenrolled, can look the other way when they swear an oath to the Constitution. When they have a solution in front of them that follows historical court precedent and creates a new model for all states to protect their citizens, not just those that are liberal and willing to pass red flag laws, but those states that are more conservative and rural that are looking at a way to protect their citizens and honor the Constitution. How those liberal legislators, who seemed fine with looking the other way when a gun owner's rights are robbed from them, but will stand in the streets and protest and burn businesses to the ground for their issues that they believe are a threat to freedom. This debate on yellow and red flag is a perfect example where we have weak, if not pathetic, leadership around this country. these groups could have always come together, but they don't want to honor due precedent in your rights. Some have decided that guns are a scourge on our society and must be removed. Let's be honest about that. Our organization has found a path. We have worked and we've taken our political beating to find ways to get the gun community, the gun rights community, and others to work together to make our communities safer. And that is a segue into the next segment, which is a good example. I'm going to use the Press Herald editorial as an example of how some that are saying they want us to work together are disingenuous, because if they did, they wouldn't change the facts, and they certainly would insult those groups that were doing that very thing. With that, if you don't, Becky, do you have any questions? Daniel, do you have any questions?
Well, yeah. One is basically an example, and I'll let you speak to it. Now, say I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm a hunter, and I am on a piece of property, and I neglect to get permission. It's not posted, and I encounter the homeowner or the property owner, and under a red flag. Now, if we were operating under that system, all that landowner would have to do is call the police and state, I threatened him with a firearm. Even though I didn't, but that's all they would need to do, and my due process would be gone.
Right. So there are some protections in the red flag legislation that person really needs to be known, or like if it was a neighbor that was hunting on your property, and that landowner called the police and said, yeah, I want to file a ex post facto red flag complaint with the court. In that scenario, yes, that person could have a red flag filed against them. The landowners, the first thing they should do is call the game warden and say, I've told this individual I don't want them on my property. Come get them off. Most of the time they're going to leave. Yep. So, in that situation, yes, it gets dicey, because when a person who potentially just knows you in a limited way, one person's feeling of threat can be completely different than another. I've had people call me and say, well, a hunter just walked down the right of way behind my property, and I'm really scared. I don't want them back there with a gun. If that's how people want the red flag to be used, doesn't that really just back up what I've said? Is that they want laws that anytime a firearm is seen, we can force those to be confiscated by the police, and then you as an individual have to prove you're not a risk. Red flag, in my opinion, needs to be challenged in the federal courts all the way to the Supreme Court. A search warrant should never be issued on a citizen when there's no even hint of a crime or a potential crime in that area to be searched. If we start doing that, let's just flush the Fourth Amendment. You have no protections in your home. There's a number of amendments that are compromised by red flag. So in my opinion, if folks want to move forward without the highest levels of due process, I'm in hopes that organizations like mine, the NRA, and others will challenge them all the way to the Supreme Court. I will tell you what will happen. The Supreme Court will honor our due process if it ever reaches that level. Because there is no exemption because you're a law-abiding citizen and own a gun from individual freedoms. When you start singling out gun owners for persecution by the police and by the courts, you violated their constitutional freedoms, and the courts will strike it down. That's the path we had been following. Maine showed us a path where you could make our community safer and honor due process. And that's why it's such a threat to some that support taking your firearms away.
That is all I have, unless Becky has a question. I think we can.
Okay. With that, thank you. That's the end of segment 2. For those folks that believe the way we do, that want to join the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, we are in a battle constantly to keep our rights. all of the good positive things we've done are we have to constantly battle to keep in place. The only way you keep them is a strong organization like ours that can influence people at the State House. With that, thank you, and that's the end of segment 2. Segment 3, I will speak specifically to the Press Herald editorial and why I'm so upset with it. I feel personally insulted by it. So with that, thank you.